Chapter 31, Saturday, 11:30 a.m. After breakfast, Xander decided he needed fresh air and sunshine. He and David set off to explore their property. Every few minutes, Xander found himself looking back through the trees at the house. He kept expecting to see something not right, an angle or an addition that wasn't true, or, as before, a whole chunk of house just up and gone. If the house played tricks, it wasn't doing it today. The irregular squeak, squeak, squeak of the weather vane on top of the tower continually reminded him of its looming presence. They'd been out a while, and his hunger told him it was close to lunchtime. Some time ago, David had wandered off toward the back, while Xander explored the dense forest on the side of the house. Bushes and trees had gone unpruned for decades. Even at midday, the area was cloaked in shadow. Enough sunlight seeped through to render flashlights unnecessary, but no one would mistake Xander's trek through the bush for a cheery walk in the park. Most interesting to him were the fallen trees. They lay here and there in various stages of decomposition. Rolling them over, when they were small enough or decayed enough, revealed swarming worlds of beetles and centipedes, spiders and worms. He always tried to find the stump of a fallen tree. Sometimes it was nearby. Other times he'd have to walk around to find it, usually up an embankment, and he'd make up stories about how the trees fell. Lightning, beavers, some dudes fooling around with an axe. Probably most had simply died and fallen over, but that was boring. He had his camera out now and was filming a black beetle crawl over one of Toria's dolls in macro lens mode when he heard David calling him. He kept the camera rolling and brought the camera up to capture his brother's progress through the woods. David moved toward him, stepping into and out of the shafts of light, into and out of view. Then he veered away, still calling. Xander considered letting him wander completely out of sight and out of earshot. That would make a funny short film, if a bit abstract. Deciding against being mean today, he yelled, "Over here!" "Come see something," David said, and leaping over bushes and deadfalls to reach him. "What is it?" Xander asked. David puzzled at the overturned log and Toria's Barbie. Ants were swarming over her face and through her hair. "What are you doing?" he asked. Xander smiled. "The doll represents average man or woman, and the bugs are all the little problems that plague him. See? I think I like it better when you are making movies about skateboarders wiping out." "I am now l'artiste," Xander said, trying to sound as French as Francois Truffaut, and he raised his fingers to the sky in a flourish, thinking he looked flamboyant and artsy. He was enjoying the dual distractions of the outdoors and his cinematic aspirations. His brother thought about that, and he said, "Whatever, come see what I found." "Is it cool?" It's weird." Xander paused. He wasn't so sure he could take any more weird. "Not like last night," David assured him. "Kind of, I don't know, just weird. It won't make you think you're crazy or anything." And then he said, I don't think it will." "Okay, lead the way," Xander said, and they pushed deeper into the woods behind the house. At times, the bushes and brambles, trees and branches were so thick they had to walk around as surely as they would a mountain. Xander watched the house recede, becoming less distinct through all the foliage. After a time, he could see it no more. The shadows were even darker here, and it made Xander think of the Hansel and Gretel woods, how they got lost in them. More accurately, it resembled the woods in every werewolf movie he'd ever seen. "How much further?" he asked. "Just up here." "How'd you get this far from the house?" David had ventured at least 3 times the distance Xander had. "I thought I heard something." "Like what?" "Footsteps. Breaking branches and crunching." "Footsteps? Out here?" "Well, and then there was the laughing." Xander stopped. "David, with everything we've gone through, you followed footsteps and laughter into the creepiest woods we've ever seen?" David shrugged. "I didn't think anything would happen outside the house. It wasn't spooky laughter. More like," he thought about it, "a kid on a playground." "You haven't seen nearly enough movies. Children are a vital part of ghost stories. They lure you in, and then wham!" And he punched his fist into his palm. David shook his head, and he turned and kept going. Xander hesitated and then followed. "See there?" David said. Through the trees ahead, sunlight broke through. It wasn't a mere shaft, but a radiant glow covering a wide area. A clearing. Xander thought if David had found a stone altar, he was going back to the motel, with or without everybody else. But when he stepped out of what had become an impossibly dense forest, he was both fascinated and puzzled. Fascinated because out of the untamed wilderness was a meadow half the size of a football field. The ground was mostly flat and covered in thick green grass. No rocks, bushes, or trees marred its park-like perfection. It was shaped like an egg, its boundaries well defined by the dark, imposing forest that completely surrounded it. Overhead, the canopy of the treetops leaned in, forming a natural dome. At the center, an opening revealed blue sky and white clouds. The strangest aspect of this area could not be seen, only felt. It was as though Xander had instantly ascended to the top of a high mountain. The air was cooler, and it felt thinner. It rushed into his lungs with ease, giving him a mild jolt of energy. When Xander was David's age, oxygen bars were all the rage. Dad was curious and took him to one. They held masks over their mouths and noses and breathed in a canister of oxygen, kind of like you see in hospitals. Both of them had decided the gimmick was a ripoff. However, the purchased air did somehow taste better than regular air, and it made them morning perky. The air in the meadow felt and tasted just like that. "What is this?" Xander asked. David shook his head. "I mean, it can't be natural, can it?" At first, Xander had thought the same thing. Now he saw imperfections humans wouldn't leave. The ground under the grass was bumpy, wavy. The trees encroached into the area just enough to give the perimeter a slightly shabby appearance. Despite the unmistakable dome of the leafy canopy, there was no evidence any pruning had occurred. If someone had carved the clearing from the forest, it had not been tended to in a long time. As Xander's eyes scanned upward, David said, "But that's not all." Xander laughed. His brother had stepped out 20 feet into the meadow. "Say that again," he said. "I said that's not all." "Why are you talking like that?" "Like what?" "Your voice. It's higher pitched." David's voice had not yet started changing, and when he answered the phone, people still mistook him for their mother or sometimes even Toria. While not dramatic, his voice was even higher now. Xander walked towards him. "I've listened to you enough to know that you sound—" As he spoke, the pitch of his own voice rose. Not to an unnatural level, but the way it did when he got excited or whiny about something. "Hello? Hello? Hear that?" "I'm talking right now," David said. He was listening to his own voice, nodding, an open-mouthed grin widening with each word. And Xander said, "Can you hear it in me?" "Yeah?" David started howling like a wolf. His pitch rose to ear-splitting, glass-breaking levels. All right, Xander said, covering his ears. "Stop it." "Now look," David said, and he ran out into the meadow and then back. "Okay," Xander said. "Well, what do I do?" Xander looked at him from the corner of his eye. "You ran. How fast?" "All out sprint, dude." And then he noticed David was not out of breath, and he said, "Well, I mean, wasn't it?" David shook his head. "I was jogging. Now watch this." And he walked away. He ran past Xander at a pretty good clip, but nothing stunning. And then he jumped. A little too high and a little too far. It was nothing most people would probably notice, but this close, and knowing him so well, Xander knew it wasn't normal. Xander took off across the field. He didn't feel like Dash, that fast kid in The Incredibles. It simply felt like a good run on a good day, and he leapt into the air. From his own perspective, he realized it was the best jump of his whole life. Directly in front of him, a man climbed through the brambles and stepped into the clearing. Xander braked and fell back onto his butt. It was Dad, thank goodness. He had leaves in his hair. One sleeve of his sweatshirt was pushed up over his elbow, the other down around his wrist. Sweat had soaked through in the shape of his sternum. "Xander?" David said. He sounded excited. And then Xander realized it was a casual greeting, and the excited part was the tricky air, making his voice higher than normal. His father reached him and held out a hand to help him up. As Xander rose, he said, "What are you doing here?" David ran up and stood by his brother's side. "Out looking for you," Dad said. "I've got to run some errands, and I'd like you boys to stay in the house." Xander realized Dad had not commented on the clearing at all. let alone the strangeness of the air and the way it affected their voices. How did you come from over there? He asked his father, pointing, which was the opposite direction from the house. Dad looked over his shoulder as if just catching that, and he said, I heard you guys, but you know how sounds are around here. I must have gotten lost. Must have gotten really lost, David said, and he reached up and pulled a leafy twig out of Dad's hair. Dad smiled. Are these crazy woods or what? Xander said, Where were you out this way earlier today? The other day I was. I found this clearing. And he looked around in wonder and shook his head. Well, what do you think this place is? David said. More weirdness day, but pretty lightweight stuff compared, you know? And he winked. Xander knew what he meant. Still, it bothered him to find yet another oddity on their property. It was like all the anomalies of the world had congregated on this one spot. Or more likely, one truly weird abnormality happened here, and smaller drops of strangeness splattered out from it. He pictured a dollop of paint falling from God's palette, striking the earth where the house stood now. Its splatter made things like the clearing, and who knows what else. As Dad passed them, he gave David a healthy shove. The kid fell and tumbled, further than he should have, laughing all the way. Chapter 32, Saturday, 11:55 p.m. When Xander returned from a late-night bathroom run, David was not in his bed. The covers were folded back, exposing only sheets and a pillow. Had he been there when Xander got up? Yeah, he thought. He remembered hearing David's rhythmic breathing. It was only a little after 11, but the day spent outside had worn them out. The boys had crashed around 10. Xander had watched the shadows on the ceiling, falling in and out of light sleep until he realized he had to visit the bathroom. Maybe David had felt the same need and, finding the bathroom occupied, went to one of the others. David, he whispered, in case the boy was hiding. No answer. Xander crawled in bed, pulled the cover over his shoulder, closed his eyes. They snapped open again, and he threw his blankets and jumped up. David, he said louder. Oh, no. And then he ran from the room and down the hall, past the foyer, past their parents' bedroom to where the hallway bent, and went towards the back of the house. By the illumination of the nightlight, he saw the false wall was angled into the hallway, leaving a gap of several feet. David! He ran through, scraping his injured arm on the edge. He felt the pain, but did not allow it to distract him. The second door, the one with the metal skin, was also open. He slammed into the door jamb, rolled off and through, and started up the stairs. A flashlight clicked on, blinding him. David! What took you so long? He was sitting on the landing. What are you doing? Xander's concern had instantly turned to anger. I promised I wouldn't go into the rooms without you. Well, then what are you doing? Xander repeated. Waiting for you. I can come here anytime I want. See? Wait, what are you saying? I want to know what it's like. Just once. David, there is no way. Just once, Xander. Come on. You can help me or not. Well, you promised. I'm not breaking it, but I'll take it back if you don't help. Xander's heart felt squeezed to the size of a raisin. David was honest, but that didn't always translate into being good. Scoot over, Xander said, and he sat beside his brother. While David played the light over the stairs, the open door below, and occasionally down the hotel-like corridor, Xander told him about fighting the gladiator. He did not spare any detail. The bodies, the sword crashing down onto the shield, the soldiers who attacked when he had begged them for help, the close calls when he thought he was dead. David listened without making a sound. When Xander finished, they sat quietly. David had stilled his hand. The light shined on his sneakers. And after a few minutes, Xander felt his brother's hand on his shoulder. David said, I'm sorry that happened to you. Well, you see why I don't want you to do it, right? At first, David didn't reply. And then he whispered, I have to. If I don't, I'll always wonder, my whole life. If you do, your whole life may not be very long. Xander had to admit this was consistent with David's personality. He had dirt biked and scuba dived, hit a black diamond slope on their fourth trip to Mammoth Mountain, and had even flown in an ultralight with a friend's father. Xander was into adventure as well, but never with David's degree of enthusiasm. Dad called it reckless abandon. David could ramble on for hours about the things he wanted to do when he became old enough. pilot a jet, bungee from some bridge on the Zimbabwe-Zambia border, a street luge, which was like putting wheels on your back and flying down the longest, scariest road you could find. Once, when the dinner time conversation turned to how each of them wanted to die, Xander had said, "In my sleep." Yeah, that sounded like a decent way to go. David had said, "I want to hang glide into a cliff when I'm 90. Okay, that was like super cool, Xander had admitted to himself. And then David added, in all seriousness, or get eaten by a shark. He did not have a death wish. He wouldn't be the first person to say he wanted to live a long, long time. So he could do all of the things he dreamed about doing. It was more like, for David, life was most exciting when you could lose it. Xander didn't think David had actually figured that out yet, but it was true. Now that Xander thought about it, he'd been an idiot to think he could keep David out of those rooms. His little brother got scared like everyone did. He was just very adept at pushing his fear aside, when doing so led to some grand new adventure. Look, Xander said, if I go along with it, I pick which room. Not something stupid, not like the one with the beach towel. That one sounds like a lot of fun to me. David just looked at him. Xander said, okay, but nothing with a weapon, all right? A weapon seems like a bad sign. Well, if the only rooms that look cool are the ones with weapons. Nope, Xander said. No weapons, no matter what. When David didn't respond, he added, otherwise, I'll drag your butt to Dad right now. He'll brick up that wall right there, and if that doesn't work, I'll kick and scream until we move. All right, already, no weapons. Before his brother's agreement had registered in Xander's mind, David was standing and stepping towards the corridor. He flipped the switch and turned on the lights. Xander stepped up behind him. Well, do you know which room? Antechamber? Wait, what? That's what Dad called these rooms. Antechambers. Whatever. Do you know which one? David shook his head. Xander stepped past David and opened the first door. That's the beach towel room, David complained. No, it's not. Hanging from the hooks were astronauts' helmets, a metallic spacesuit, something that looked like a pistol, but may have been a welding torch. There were a few other items consistent with outer space adventure. Whoa, David said, looking past Xander. Xander quickly said, that's a gun. That's a weapon. That's not a weapon. I said not this one. And Xander slammed the door. He opened it again, peered in. He clicked it shut once more, and he said, I think you're right. This was the beach towel room. Duh. Those beach things with the flip-flops, they were the first thing we saw, remember? Xander nodded. Well, it changed. David scrunched his nose, hitched up his top lip. Would Dad do that? I mean, why would he? And Xander thought about it. It's not like someone just switched the things around. I mean, I don't remember seeing astronaut stuff. I mean, I know we checked each room. David nodded in agreement. Somebody put brand new stuff in here. Simultaneously, they gazed up at the corridor at the other doors. About 10 minutes later, they had rechecked every room. About half of the themes were ones they had seen the previous night, though both brothers thought they were in different rooms. The other themes were new altogether. Who's doing it, do you think? David asked. Xander was squinting at the doors. I don't know, but they went into every room again, verifying that none of the themes had changed since their last inspection. None had. Maybe they change at a specific time, Xander suggested. Or when no one else is around? They were silent for a while, and at last David clapped his hands together. He strolled up to the center of the carpeted runner. Let's see, which one had... Thinking. The police badge and uniform. No weapons, Xander reminded him. That one didn't have the pistol. You'd probably wind up smack in the middle of a bank robbery. Xander caught the spark in David's eye before he turned away. David? I know. How about the one with the robe and the carabiners? Or the rope and the carabiners? Xander tossed his hands up. You don't know how to mountain climb. Those places don't suddenly give you new skills. They just drop you right in. David opened a door, and he turned a smile on Xander and then stepped through. What? Xander said, rushing to catch the door before it shut. Khaki-colored safari hat, compass, a vest with many pockets and loops and straps, a canteen on a utility belt, a machete. On the bench were knee-high leather boots. A jungle? Xander said. David grinned and nodded. Xander said, "Oh, come on. It's a machete. That's a weapon." "It's a tool. I'll probably have to cut my way out of some bushes, that's all." Xander didn't like it, but a deal was a deal. He pulled the utility belt off of its hook and held it out to David. The boy hesitated. When he reached for it, his hand trembled. Xander's eyebrows went up. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." His voice was high, like it had been in the clearing. His tongue clicked dryly in his mouth. Xander thought if Richard Dreyfuss in Jaws. He thought of Richard Dreyfuss in Jaws when he was preparing to go into the shark cage. He was so afraid he couldn't spit into his diving mask to keep it from fogging up. Now there was a David personality for you, scared but willing to do it anyway. David cinched the belt around his waist. Xander handed him the machete. He unsheathed it and gave it the once over. He clipped it to the belt. Xander set the helmet on his brother's head. It was too big and made him look like he was 5 years old. "Dad's gonna kill me," Xander said. David reached for the second door's handle. "Wait!" Xander screamed. "Don't open that door. I'll be right back." "What?" David said. "Just wait. Don't move." Xander hurried out of the room. Even with reining in his speed on the stairs and tiptoeing past the master bedroom, he reached his and Day's room and was back in the antechamber upstairs in no more than a minute. He held his camcorder up to David. "Here, take this." "I don't want that," David protested. "What if I need my hands? What if I lose it?" Xander let the camera drop to the end of his long leather strap. He slipped it over David's head so it hung around his neck. "I'll turn it on now," he said, flipping the power switch and pushing the record button. "If you think about it, point it at something. If you don't, we'll still have proof you went somewhere. You might not want to burp or anything too embarrassing, though." "Oh, you mean like scream?" David asked, and he opened the inner door. The antechamber instantly became more humid. A botanical fragrance wafted in. Beyond the threshold, fat, green leaves swayed in a breeze. Trees rose out of sight, hairy-looking vines looped down, almost touching the moss-covered earth. "Are you sure about this?" Xander asked. David nodded. He tightened the helmet strap under his chin. Xander said, How long was I gone last night?" David shrugged. "I don't know, 20 minutes? So it's probably all in real time. A minute over there is a minute here. If you're not back in 15 minutes, I'm going to get Dad and come after you." David nodded, and he stepped through. The door pulled out of Xander's grip and slammed shut. Chapter 33. David watched the door waver and fade away. The moist heat drew sweat from his face and neck. The plants seemed to quiver, but whether from wind or some kind of ground tremor, David didn't know. The cushy grasses and moss prevented him from feeling much else under his feet. A bird cawed in the distance. It was a sound like an alarm that set David's nerves on edge. He was already thinking about how he would get back. If the door had vanished, where would he find the portal to home? He did want to experience this world, but he would have felt a lot better knowing where the exit was. He trusted that somehow, either with Xander's help or as Dad had said, through some signal from items he held, the portal would reveal itself. He stepped to the fern where the door had shimmered and ceased to be. He was moving the leaves around when a centipede, as long as his arm and as thick as a hot dog, scuttled up in the frond towards his hand. Its front half rose up, as if to look David in his eyes. Its many legs wiggled and waved. Huge pincers coming off of its head clamped and opened. Unsure if the thing could leap or how fast it could move, if it decided David looked like a tasty treat, he reversed another few steps. His heel crunched on something. A brown and yellow beetle, as big as an egg, oozed yellow guts from its shattered shell. 3 others, bigger, moving quickly towards David, perhaps intent on avenging their friend. He gingerly danced away on tiptoes. "I should have put on the boots," he thought, and he backed into something that moved easily under David's touch, a long, fat snake hanging from a branch. David yelled and then laughed at himself. It was only a vine. He sighed and then spotted a real snake, slithering down the vine in his direction. Having already yelled, he bit his tongue and backed away. His heart was a ferret caged within his chest, panicky to get out. It seemed to jump and twirl and bang against his breastbone and his ribs. Its frantic beats made little room for the expansion of his lungs, and he found breathing to be difficult. Well away from the snake and centipede and the beetles, he stopped. He scanned the area and saw no immediate threats. He closed his eyes and forced himself to take a long, deep breath. He lifted Xander's camera off of his stomach, where it had been bouncing at the end of its strap. He made sure the record light was on and then held it to his face. He zoomed in on the vine and the snake, panned to the plant where the centipede had been. He didn't see it now in the little camera's LCD screen. Nearby, something roared. It was a big animal, a wild cat maybe. David lowered the camera, and it roared again. And he wondered if it had caught his scent and was crooning its excitement about finding an exotic meal. As if in answer, a second animal roared in the opposite direction, but seemingly just as near. The next roar came from a third beast, between the first two, but further off. That ferret in his chest had found his throat and was pushing up into it. David shook his head. Considering Xander's experience, it was just like that house to drop him into a big cat territory. From the roars, he figured he was in their favorite feeding zone, and it was dinner time. And for all he knew, the portal issued a frequency only tigers could hear, the big cat equivalent of a dinner bell. He had thought tiger, but he didn't know their roars from any other big cats. At one time or another, he had heard them all at the San Diego Zoo, but he wasn't nerd enough about animals to distinguish the difference. He thought he had read somewhere, or maybe it was from the Singing Animals of the Jungle Book, that the only big cats in jungle settings were leopards, panthers, and tigers. The roars were throaty and loud. I mean, it had to be tigers. Whatever they were, he didn't want to hang around to find out. He unsheathed the machete. Its weight felt good in his hand, and he admired the gleaming edge. One of the beasts roared again. Almost immediately, it received an answering call. Both seemed closer, and David realized how awfully true his statement to Xander had been. The machete was a tool, not a weapon. He held still, willing it or the hat and the utility belt to show him the way to the portal. He felt nothing. No tug, no weightiness in the one direction or another. Maybe he had to move, get closer to the portal before the item started drawing him toward it. He swung the machete down into a leaf the size and thickness of a beach towel. It fell away before him, and he smiled. He sliced again and again, stepping forward each time. Blazing a path, he thought. Isn't that what they say? So he blazed. He had no clue where he would end up, but he believed he was putting ground between him and the tigers. He swung the machete diagonally, lopping away a leaf and a branch. They fell to the ground, revealing a snarling face of a tiger. Its head was huge, twice the size of David's. The cat had pulled back onto its haunches, one paw up, ready to strike. Its claws were curved blades. A single one could cause butcher knife damage. 5 would take his face off and open him up. He jumped back, but amazingly did not scream. He could not even breathe. He raised the machete over his head and turned it so that the big cat could see it. It hissed, baring its teeth the size of railroad spikes. Its eyes watched David intently. He had heard something about what not to do with great predators. If he remembered right, turning and running would be the end of him. Rather, he backed away slowly. The animal did not move. Reversing along the path that he had blazed, he moved around a bend and lost sight of the beast. Almost directly behind him, lost among the heavy leaves, another tiger roared. Certainly not the same one. It could not have. Finishing his thought for him, the tiger in front roared. The third tiger joined in, and off to his left, David's entire body shook with fear. Dang it, Xander, he thought. You could be wrong sometimes, With no other place to go, he turned right and pushed through the tangle of vines and branches and plants with their stupid bath towel leaves. He avoided using the machete, thinking its rhythmic chopping would bring the tigers more quickly, the way a thrashing fish drew sharks. For just a moment, he thought of the centipede and snake and wondered if he'd run into more of them. And just as quickly, he dismissed the thought. Those things were just pests in a world full of true killers. He wished the creepy crawlers were all that he had to worry about. Unable to cross the particularly dense spot, he chopped at it with the machete. A tiger roared. It sounded close. Leaves rustled nearby. Something was moving alongside him. 20 feet away, he pushed forward and it moved again, pacing him. He realized he had been hearing the thunderous sound of a waterfall. For a time, he had mistaken it for his own blood rushing past his ears. Hope welled in him. A waterfall meant water, and cats didn't like water. He pushed towards it, chopping and cutting when he had to. He hoped none of the cats realized what he was doing and cut him off. Something moved, heavy and fast, behind him. He spun, machete raised, expecting to see only the gaping maw of a tiger as it leapt at him. Instead, furry, striped hindquarters and a tail flashed past. The thing had run right past him. He didn't know if tigers tormented their prey or if they simply were cautious hunters. He felt tormented and he felt hunted. Then the jungle stopped, just like that. It gave way to a granite edge of a cliff. Way down below, a river sparkled. The waterfall he'd heard was half a mile away. The other side of the chasm was a long way off. And the tigers were so very close. Like a gift from heaven, the only a stone's throw away was a bridge spanning the chasm. It was made of rope and wooden planks. If he beat the tigers across it, he could cut the ropes on the other side, separating them from their meal. A tiger roared. David thought it sounded like a laugh, and he hurried along the rock ledge to the bridge. Movement behind him. A snapped twig, leaves flung aside with the sound of a wind-ripped sail, of pounding heavy paws. He stepped onto the first planks, testing them. The wood felt solid, but the bridge was wobbly. He took another tentative step, ready to run if the tigers appeared, but they were nowhere in sight. What did appear were men on the other side of the bridge. They were dark-skinned and scantily dressed, some kind of aboriginal tribe, David guessed. He did not know where in the world he was or what these people might be called. The three he had first noticed became triple that as he poured from the dense brush. Certainly they were hunters and would want the tigers. In fact, they carried spears and bows and arrows. He hurried toward them. Two of the archers took aim. David looked back. There were no animals. Perhaps these hunters had spooked them. One archer released his arrow. David had to duck to avoid being skewered through the head. "Hey!" he yelled. The camera swung against his chest. The other archer fired. The arrow sailed a few inches from David's right arm. A spear came next, in a shallow arc designed to impale him. He dropped straight down onto the planks. The camcorder, he'd forgotten all about it, struck him hard in the chin. The machete flipped out of his hand and pinwheeled into the abyss. The spear clattered on the wood behind him. The bridge began to shake. David closed his eyes and gripped the edges. More shaking. The hunters had mounted the bridge and were running towards him in single file. He lifted a shaking hand to one of the ropes that acted as a handrail for the crossers. He pulled himself up and tore quickly away from the approaching hunters. Ahead, a section of tall fronds whipped back and forth violently and then stopped. A tiger roared. An arrow whizzed across his shoulder, slicing his t-shirt. It continued on to thunk into a tree, where it quivered, as though furious about missing its mark. David stepped off the bridge. He darted left along the rock ledge. A spear struck the ground 3 feet ahead of him and snapped in two. Each piece swung into a different direction. Abruptly, he turned and plunged into the jungle. One of the big cats snarled nearby. It thrashed through the underbrush, as big and as heavy as a car. David veered away from him. Ahead of him, a tiger roared. He stopped. The thrashing continued for another few seconds and then stilled. Breathing, panting, under it a rolling almost like a purr. Not friendly or loving, for sure. This was more of a satisfied sound. The creature knew it was going to get what it wanted. More rustling in front of David. The inhalation and exhalation of a second beast reached his ears. Further off, the pattering of bare feet on the wood-planked bridge, growing louder. A fat raindrop struck David's head. Rain, he thought, just what I need right now. Another drop splattered on his shoulder. He felt it. It was sticky. He looked up. The third tiger was crouched on a branch high above him. At least for now, it seemed content to watch. He thought that it was particularly feline trait, to watch or play with its food until it grew bored and then the banquet started. He believed his only choice was to break through the jungle and leap off the cliff. He really didn't think he would survive the fall, even if he hit the water far below. But he would rather have that one chance in a million than no chance at all with these tigers and the hunters. But it was too late. He could barely see over the top of the greenery in front of him. A dark gap, a thick crack in the surface of a frozen lake, was moving directly for him. A beast was approaching fast, flattening the grass and plants as it came. Behind him, a branch cracked loudly. The breathing became a growl. It grew louder with each pounding step of the beast. From two sides, he thought, three, if the one above gets involved, I'm going to be torn apart. And he screamed. Eyes wide, jaw set, Xander pushed out of the bushes in front of David. He grabbed David by the head and yanked him back, and the bushes engulfed him. Xander, what are you? Shut up and come on. Xander began crawling on his hands and knees. Every few feet, he'd stop to pull David closer. The camcorder dragged on the ground, snagging on things, making David yank it with his neck. Behind him, the tigers were going crazy, growling, roaring, and by the sounds of it, swiping at the jungle with their claws. What are we doing? David whispered, his voice harsh, almost guttural. Where are we going? There are tigers. I know, Xander said, and he pulled David alongside him, threw his arm over his back, and gave him a squeeze. Do you feel it? That tug Dad talked about. No, and then he did. A gentle tug on the utility belt, as though Xander had his finger looped into it, but he didn't. The helmet, too, seemed a bit heavier on the upper right side, the same direction the belt was yearning to go. That way, he said. Right, it has to be close. I just stepped out of the antechamber. They crawled through the underbrush. The tigers roared and hissed and pawed. They knew where their meal was. They were taking their time and enjoying the hunt. David's helmet grew heavier, pulling his head suddenly to the side. The belt almost yanked his hips past his body. Xander said, Here, hold on. The brothers rolled as one and fell into a hole. I'm stopping it right there. So good. So good.